Hello and welcome to another edition of Ideological. I'm your host, Zach Lee, and today we are talking about one of the most influential figures in intellectual history, and he is a guy that I think is the devil. I think he's the worst. Other people like him, but he is, whether you love him or hate him, super, super influential. His name is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. You may have heard of him, you may have not, but if you haven't, it's your fault because he's a big deal. Now, he is the guy. Let me say it this way. Did you ever play this game when you were a kid? Or maybe you play it now, where you say, hey, if I were to go back in history, who is somebody that I would kill to make the world better? We've all played that game, and usually people pick Hitler, which is a great pick, by the way. It would be great to go back and kill Hitler. He's a despicable figure. For some reason, not enough people pick Stalin, who's way worse than Hitler. I think Hitler killed something like 6 million Jews. I think Stalin killed upwards of maybe 100 million on the high side. So whether it's right-wing collectivism or left-wing collectivism gets people killed. I always, when somebody asks me that question, I always just say something funny like Mother Teresa, who I think is great. It's a funny answer. My actual answer to that question, though, is this guy. If I could go back in history and kill one figure, it would be Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Let me pause for a quick promotion by Red Bull. I'm just kidding. They don't actually sponsor this. That would be my pick. There's a great line from the show The Office where Michael Scott says, if I had a gun with 2 bullets and I was in a room with Hitler, bin Laden, and Toby, which is a guy he does not like in The Office, I would shoot Toby twice.
If I had a gun with 2 bullets and I was in a room with Hitler, bin Laden, and Toby, I would shoot Toby twice.
That's how I feel. If I was in a room with Hitler and bin Laden and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and I had a gun with 2 bullets, I would shoot Rousseau twice, and then I would continue to beat his dead body with the pistol, okay? Having said that, though, this guy is tremendously influential. He is one of the most influential thinkers in history, and he's certainly the most famous man to ever come out of Geneva, far more popular than John Calvin, who's probably the second most famous man to come out of Geneva. Though he was mainly self-educated, he is nowhere near the brilliance of like a Kant or a Leibniz or a Hume or some of these better thinkers. But despite the fact that his arguments are often incoherent, despite the fact that he does not have the educational pedigree of most of the major thinkers around this time, his influence is absolutely enormous. He is the forerunner to the following movements: postmodernism, existentialism, Marxism, communism, romanticism, and all the oppressions and beheadings of the French Revolution. Standing behind all that are these seeds of thought from Rousseau. Sigmund Freud considered him to be a hero, and he's explicitly quoted with approval by Karl Marx. In fact, if you don't understand Rousseau, you do not understand Marx. Even if you've read Marx, you have to understand Rousseau first. He was inspirational to Johann Herder, Johann Fichte, Hegel, and Immanuel Kant. Okay, these are big figures. Kant was known to be so precise, so logical, that it was said that you could set your watch by his daily constitutional. Like the people in his town could look out the window and say, Kant's going for his walk now. He always does that at 2 p.m. It must be exactly 2 p.m. He was that rigid in his scheduling. And yet it said that he was only late one day in his life, and it was the day that he read Rousseau. He only had one picture in his office. It was hanging above his desk, and it was a picture of Rousseau. Maximilien Robespierre, you know the guy of the terror in the French Revolution that beheaded all the people with the national razor? He said this of Rousseau: Rousseau is the one man who, through the loftiness of his soul and the grandeur of his character, showed himself worthy of the role of teacher of mankind. Holy crap. So this guy's influence is enormous. I think it's a negative influence, but I'm usually pretty what I think is unbiased in these things, but I'm not in this episode. I think Rousseau's the worst. But we're going to learn a little bit about his life. We're going to learn a little bit about his thought, and it should be a ton of fun. And I'm going to drink this Red Bull because it's morning where I'm recording, and I use it for dramatic effect. I'll say something like, and then Rousseau did this bad thing, and then I'll take a sip. You'll love it. Just hang with me. Let's talk about his life first. He was born on June 28th, 1712. And he is a freaking weird guy. His mom died 10 days after he was born, and his dad never really recovered from that loss, and he kind of read that emotional baggage back onto Rousseau. So imagine that you're a young boy, and your dad, when he's talking to you, is just always heartbroken because his wife is dead. And his wife died right after you were born. And though it's not your fault, he still has this weight. And so you're talking to your dad and you're wanting to have a good time, and then he just starts crying. And so all this weird emotional baggage was kind of read onto young Rousseau, which is sad. Could have led to maybe some of his weird mental stuff later. His brother ran away from home and basically disappeared. So that's strange. That's just your brother runs away and you never really hear from him again. That's part of Rousseau's life. His dad got into an argument with a public landowner and challenged him to a duel. The man refused to duel Rousseau's dad because the dad was of a lower social rank. So Rousseau's dad took his sword and struck the landowner on the cheek, and he had to flee to avoid going to jail. This meant that 8-year-old Rousseau had to go live with a local pastor and the pastor's sister. Now, here's a very interesting thing about Rousseau. At this point, he's 8 years old. The pastor's sister that he's living with, because he's living with the pastor, is 30. And she used to beat him and like whip him with like, little thin sticks and things like this. And that produced in him a love of sexual masochism for the rest of his life. Even though he was 8, she was 30, Rousseau would later write a novel about a male tutor and a domineering aristocratic woman that he comments on having full breasts, by the way, named Julie. But this Julie would be a prototype for several of his other lovers. So he gets disciplined by this pastor's sister, and it produces in him kind of a love of early BDSM. And he will carry that with him the rest of his life, okay? He would carry the love of being sexually beaten by dominant women with him the rest of his life. This is probably the only place that I agree with Rousseau. So let that be what it may. Wait, emphasis. My wife told me not to make that joke, but there it is. He changed religions several times. He went from Protestant to Catholic, back to like a very stern Calvinistic form of Protestant. And then he ended with a type of like heretical deistic Christianity of his own making. Kind of this just generic God that starts everything. And yes, there's an afterlife, and we mainly need religion for social cohesion, but it becomes kind of made up and squishy. He had many lovers and used many prostitutes. He tells a story of one such prostitute named Zulieta, of whom he was enamored, until one day he saw that she had a malformed nipple and then considered her a monster. Again, Rousseau, he's a weird guy. At 16, he fled Geneva to live in Savoy. He lived with a 30-year-old woman named Madame de Warren, and she first seduced him when he turned 21. Listen to this. Though this madam was technically his nanny, she became his lover, though he called her Mama. So again, he's got this thing for older kind of women that are more powerful than him, and so he takes his nanny that he calls Mommy as his lover. He took as a lover an illiterate 22-year-old washerwoman when he lived in Paris. She would be a constant companion throughout most of his life. Her name is Thérèse, and at 56, he finally married her at the end of his life in a ceremony that he himself conducted. Supposedly, he was into mooning women and random acts of exposing his backside. Rousseau was deeply into music, which is often a thing with very sentimental people. His musical style, though, was considered seditious. It didn't follow the traditional kind of cadence of the music of the time, so it was considered seditious. And so an effigy of Rousseau was hanged in public. And yes, it is hanged, by the way. That it's not hung. It's hanged if a noose is around your neck. So they hanged an effigy of Rousseau in public because of his seditious music. Now listen to this. If you don't think that Rousseau's a bastard, you will after this. He put all 5 of his children up for adoption right after they were born. He put all 5 of his children up for adoption and then boasted that this was a good thing. After giving them to what's called the foundling hospital, meaning the orphanage, he said this of him giving up, again, all his children right after birth to an orphanage. This arrangement seemed to me so admirable, so rational, and so legitimate that the only reason I did not boast openly of it was to spare the mother. I really saw no harm in it. All things being considered, what I chose for my children was the best for them, or so I genuinely believed. I could have wished and still wish that I had been reared and brought up in the same fashion. He says this in his Confessions. What a terrible person. Okay? Not only is he putting up all his kids for adoption because he really just doesn't want to raise them, he's saying this is the best thing for them, and I wish I would have been raised in the same way. Look at me. He died, thankfully. He's not still around, being like 250 years old or something. He died July 2nd, 1778 at the age of 66. Okay, so that's his life. Let's look at some of his key ideas, because that's really what affects us today, affects culture, affects politics, are the ideas of these figures after they pass away. The first one, mankind is naturally good and loving and kind in a state of nature. When you look at figures around the Enlightenment era, even though Rousseau's an anti-enlightenment figure, he does not think the progress is good. We'll talk about that in a second. There's constantly this idea in politics of what is called a social contract and a state of nature. What that means is this. The state of nature is what it would have been like back when we were Neanderthals, living in the woods, picking berries, living in these small communities, before we had all this reason and culture and institution and theaters and poetry and philosophy. That's the state of nature. Whether or not it actually existed, it's kind of a thought experiment. And then there's something called a social contract, which is where people come together and decide to live together under some form of government. Again, it doesn't matter whether or not there was ever actually a contract that people signed. It's a concept. It's a thought experiment. And what Rousseau wants you to know is that he thinks that people are inherently good/neutral. He is, to use a term that he would have been familiar with living in Geneva, he is a Pelagian, right? So the alternate view is that mankind is born wicked and sinful and broken, and so we have an evil nature. And you don't even need religion for this. So in evolutionary theory, if we've evolved to spread our genes and to dominate others and to be the best, we might also have an aggressive or evil nature. So this isn't just a religious thing, but Rousseau thinks that human nature is naturally good or neutral. He actually tells a story. So one of the most famous books during the Middle Ages is Augustine's Confessions. And in it, he tells a story of stealing pears, not because he actually is hungry or wants the pears, but just for the joy of sinning, just for the joy and the rush of stealing, of being evil. Well, Rousseau writes Confessions, and in a story that's weirdly similar, he talks about stealing some asparagus. The difference is that Rousseau doesn't think that he's the problem. He doesn't think that he's bad or his evil nature is what caused it. He says that he believes that he stole the asparagus because of external social pressure and his desire to help the person that asked him. He believes that's what caused the theft. So notice he thinks that mankind's naturally good. Mankind's naturally neutral. Mankind in a state of nature would be kind. If we just lived in the woods before all these societies, we would share our berries and we would encourage one another and we would have pity on one another, etc. This view is extremely important for the idea of communism. Okay, so let me just give you a little side here. We're going to have a whole lesson on Marx and communism at some point, but please listen to this. Communism believes that people are naturally good or neutral. In fact, the system would only work if that's the case. If the rich man would just hike up his slacks and get in the rice paddy and help the poor man, life would be better. If the poor person would say, now that everyone's pulling their weight and everybody's working towards this glorious utopia of this communistic state, though I was homeless and lazy, I'm now going to work hard in the factory. And communism would work if people were naturally just self-giving, naturally good, naturally only thought of others. We're not pursuing any of their own ends. The problem is that if mankind is not good, it will be an abysmal failure. And so I've mentioned this before. I think I mentioned this in the postmodernism lecture. Your view of human nature will determine your politics. If you think mankind is naturally good or neutral, then the problem with society is outside you. We just need to be educated, or we need to get rid of guns, or we need to do whatever. We need to think the problem is outside of us, not us. In fact, a big government will help us because people are good. It'll allow us to pool our resources. If you think mankind is naturally evil or aggressive or selfish, you're going to say that the problem is not outside you, it's inside you. The problem is not education, it's your nature. The problem is not a gun or whatever, it's your nature. The problem is you don't want a big government because people are bad and they're going to use that power to oppress you. So it's all going to depend on your anthropology, on how you view human nature. So it's clear, though, for Rousseau that he thinks that we are naturally good. Now, with that in mind, he thinks that authenticity is not changing who you are. What do I mean by that? His view of authenticity is the way that you're born, okay? It's not changing who you are. If you're changing who you are to fit in with society, to be better, to whatever, that is inauthentic for Rousseau. Here's what he says in Emile, or On Education. Listen to this quote when he talks about how our good natural natures and our natural freedoms in a state of nature. Freedom is found in no form of government. It is in the heart of the free man. He takes it with him everywhere. The vile man takes his servitude everywhere. The latter would be a slave in Geneva, and the former, a free man in Paris. Okay? Let me give you some other quotes from Rousseau on mankind being naturally good, especially in the state of nature. He thinks that society is what corrupts us. We'll see that in a second. But let me give you a few quotes. These both come from his work, The Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. He says this: "This author, to argue from his own principles, should say that the state of nature, being that where the care of our own preservation interferes least with the preservation of others, was of course the most favorable to peace and most suitable to mankind." There you see this idea of innocence in a state of nature. "The first person who, having enclosed a plot of land, took it into his head to say, 'This is mine,' and found people simple enough to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. What crimes, wars, murders, what miseries and horrors would the human race have been spared had someone pulled up the stakes or filled in the ditch and cried out to his fellow men, 'Do not listen to this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits of the earth belong to everyone and that the earth itself belongs to no one.'" So notice the first person that's like, "This is my plot of land and we have private property and some things will be unequal, but life will be better." He thinks that's the first person to screw everything up. And that's what's caused all the miseries. And so you see his idea that we are naturally innocent. Now, where does this play out today? Well, other than people thinking that we're naturally good or naturally neutral and we can just teach people the right way and then there won't be any more murders or rapes or anything like that. We can just educate the evil out of people. Any movement to go back to nature, to stop progress, to depopulate, to lower the temperature of global warming, all the crunchy anti-medicine stuff in our culture has its roots in Rousseau. We have kind of this romantic idea that, man, all this society and industry and technology has really ruined everything, despite the fact that we don't die from blisters anymore. And so if we would just go back to a state of nature, everything would be fine. In his work, Emile, or On Education, he thinks we also stifle children's learning. So any movement today that thinks that we should just kind of let children be, as soon as they're born, maybe they're not actually bad, maybe they're just good or neutral, we should just let the child learn for themselves. Let them crawl around. Well, you know the best way to teach a kid not to stick their tongue in the electrical socket? It's to let them do it. They'll learn that really quickly. And so his view is that we stifle children at every point. Do this, don't do this, touch this, don't touch this, when we should just be letting them do kind of what they want and let nature teach them what's right or wrong. So he was against corporal punishment, despite the fact that he liked to be spanked. He didn't think that kids should be spanked. And so again, any movement today that is against spanking kids, that thinks that kids basically come out of the womb knowing what's best for them, and we just shouldn't stifle them, we'll kind of let them set the agenda for their life. That goes back to Rousseau as well, because again, he thinks people are naturally good/neutral. Number 2, what then does make the evil in the world? If we're born good, here's Rousseau's kind of second premise. Modern institutions and modern culture and society are what make us bad. Rousseau doesn't ever feel comfortable in his own skin. Rousseau doesn't feel comfortable in his culture. He feels alienated, to use a term that would be used by Marx. That he has this desire to be who he truly is, and he feels like modern society makes one untrue to their true self. So his view is, in the state of nature, everything's good. Back when we're just wandering in the woods in little tribes, there's no problems. What corrupts us is society. As we get culture, as there's some people are wealthier than others, as we get institution, we now have to play a game. We now have to prop ourselves up. We now have to try to keep up with the Joneses. We are now looking for things like honor and social esteem and how many social media followers we have. That's not something I care about. And by that, I mean, please retweet, re-click, regram, all the things, send it to all your friends. He thinks all of that's bad. So he uses these two kinds of words, these two kind of concepts to talk about love. Okay. There's two kinds of love for Rousseau. The first is called amour de soi or amour de soi-même. And the other one is called amour propre in French. The first, amour de soi, is based on self-preservation of one's own being. So this kind of love is good. The fact that you eat and you bathe yourself and you look out for your own good, that type of self-love is good, okay? But the other type, the type that is bad for Rousseau, what he calls amour propre, it's a self-love that's based on what other people think about you. It's a self-esteem based on other people. It's social honor, and what Rousseau thinks is the main problem. So the problem is not that you have self-love. You should care for yourself. You should take care of yourself, take care of your body. You should eat good food. You should do whatever. There's this other type of caring for yourself, though, that is vanity, that's based on other people's esteem and opinion of you, amour propre, and he thinks that that is what causes the problem. Let me give you some long quotes. Again, I've got a bunch of quotes in this lecture, so I don't know which ones we'll throw on the screen and which ones we won't. Some of these are long, but the reason I'm giving you so many quotes from Rousseau is there will be some people that want to say that I am not personifying Rousseau accurately, that I have too much of an axe to grind. And so what I'm trying to do is to show you it's not just that I think he's the worst. He, by his own confession, says these terrible, terrible things. So I want you to hear it straight from the horse's mouth, that horse being Rousseau. Listen to this. This comes from his discourse on the sciences and the arts. The sciences, he's talking about the progress of the Enlightenment, which is one of the greatest things that's ever happened to humans as far as our practical lives. Medical advancements, political freedoms, all these good things that come out of the Enlightenment. Rousseau thinks all those are bad. The sciences, letters, and arts spread garlands of flowers over the iron chains with which men are burdened. Stifle in them the sense of that original liberty for which they seem to have been born. Make them love their slavery and turn them into what is called civilized peoples. So he thinks the freedom that comes out of cultural advancement is actually a form of slavery. It's kind of this turning on the head that you get in later communism, where you're not actually starving. This is the best life and you're happy. The people of North Korea are told that they have the best life in the world. Or it's like the Nazis putting Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free, over the doors of the entry gates of the concentration camps. It's kind of a psychological move. He also says this, again, in the discourse on the sciences and the arts. Nowadays, when more subtle studies and more refined taste have reduced the art of pleasing into principles, a vile and misleading uniformity governs our customs, and all minds seem to have been cast in the same mold. Incessantly, politeness makes demands. Propriety issues orders, and incessantly people follow customary usage, never their own inclinations. One does not dare to appear as what one is. What a parade of vices will accompany this uncertainty. No more sincere friendships, no more real esteem, no more well-founded trust. Suspicions, offenses, fears, coldness, reserve, hatred, and betrayal will always be hiding under this uniform and perfidious evil of politeness, under that urbanity which is so praised and which we owe to our centuries' enlightenment. All the bad things for Rousseau come as society progresses because it causes us to be inauthentic to ourselves, and instead of just loving each other in a state of nature out in the woods, again, sharing our berries, we have society and competition and inequality and all these kind of things. Let me give you another one. This one comes from the discourse on the origin of inequality, and it's talking about how mankind became corrupted. Everyone began to look at everyone else and to wish to be looked at himself, and public esteem acquired a price. The one who sang or danced best, the handsomest, the strongest, the most skillful, or the most eloquent came to be the most highly regarded. And this was the first step at once toward inequality and vice. Notice that he links those two together. From these first preferences arose vanity and contempt on the one hand, shame and envy on the other, and the fermentation caused by these new leavens eventually produced compounds fatal to happiness and innocence. Holy crap. That is Rousseau's view of culture. Current laws just keep current people in power. That's Rousseau's idea. You hear that again in communism. But the kind of society he lives in that exalts amour propre just keeps happening. And so what you need is a new type of society. This is why you see traditional institutions attacked today. Again, it has its roots in Rousseau. Why do people attack the nuclear family, the state, the military, the legal system, churches and religious institutions, tear down statues, etc., because society is founded by these traditional institutions. But that's just going to get you the kind of society that we have. If you want a new type of society, you have to tear down all the institutions and you have to start from scratch. Third thing for Rousseau, major thought. Listen to this. Reason, smartness, truth, logic, the advances in art and science and all these kind of things. Reason is harmful and is the enemy of compassion. When I said postmodernism has some of its roots in Rousseau, this is what I'm talking about. Postmodernism thinks that claims to truth are actually claims to power to oppress people. You start to see that idea of emotion over reason in Rousseau. You see it with some other figures, to be fair, before Rousseau, but it's pretty pronounced in Rousseau. Everyone's worldview comes down to this. So listen to what I'm about to say. Does logic trump emotion, or does emotion trump logic? Which one wins? They're both important, But one certainly is more true than the other. One certainly is more important than the other. That's not an oversimplification. Which one wins? We give you some quotes. This comes from Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. Reason is what engenders egocentrism, and reflection strengthens it. Reason is what turns man in upon himself. Reason is what separates him from all that troubles him and afflicts him. Philosophy is what isolates him and what moves him to say in secret at the sight of a suffering man, perish if you will, I am safe and sound. His view is, as we advance in our knowledge and advance in our reason, that makes us less moral. It makes us walk past the person who's dying in the gutter and say, well, I'm fine. That's not me. So he thinks reason is the enemy. We see this a ton today. At the beginning of every postmodern thinker is the exaltation of emotion and feeling over logic. Ignorance is often hidden under the guise of love. Notice that you see, again, Rousseau being a forerunner to that. People want you to be loving and be kind. And when you say, well, what is love? What is kindness? Is it loving to affirm a falsehood? Is it loving to just give into somebody's emotion, even if they're being irrational? Is it loving to do what makes people feel good? What if what makes them feel good is something evil? Well, just shut up about that. Don't think about that again. Just love. And you're like, what does love mean? You don't know what love is until you know what truth is. Remember, Rousseau is all about sentimentality over logic. Reason leads to learning, luxury, and sophistication. He would agree that it leads to those things. He just thinks those things all lead to moral degradation. Okay? Now, notice that Rousseau has an ethic that is based on pity. It's based on feelings. That's interesting because there's other ethical systems, even apart from a religious worldview. So you have virtue ethics with Aristotle. You have this deontological ethics with Kant. But for someone like Rousseau, it's actually just based on pity. It's based on subjective feeling. That is the basis for his ethic. Let me give you a quote from Emile. I would show that justice and goodness are not merely abstract words, pure moral beings formed by the understanding, but are true affections of the soul enlightened by reason, are hence only an ordered development of our primitive affections. And by reason alone, independent of conscience, no natural law can be established, and that the entire right of nature is only a chimera if it is not founded on a natural need in the human heart. Let's just take a moment. Let's just take a moment to emote. Next, this is the thing for Rousseau. Listen to what I'm about to say, because this is the one that is the most creepy in my mind from Rousseau. It is the concept of the general will. How come the American Revolution was successful and the French Revolution was not? Because the American Revolution was founded on Locke and individual rights, and the French Revolution was founded on Rousseau and collectivism. That's the answer. So many people will hate that I just said that, but I'm right. Let's talk about what the general will is. Okay, back up, refresh your brain. I've just given you a bunch of things from Rousseau. Maybe some of those quotes were interesting. Maybe some of them are boring to you. I don't think they're boring. I think you're boring. But let's reset our minds. Because of Locke, and in places like England and America and in the Enlightenment, there was this idea. Individual freedom, individual liberty is what is best for the whole. So a lot of times people say, okay, wait, do we want policies based on what's best for individual rights, or do we want what's best for society? They thought that that was a false dichotomy. What is best for a society is individual rights. And you say, I don't think so. I think we should overshadow some people's individual rights for the benefit of society. Well, if you say that, you've just affirmed slavery. Slavery is overcoming someone's individual rights, the rights of a minority, for the benefit of society. It's a terrible, terrible thing. Again, beware of collectivism. So the kind of view before Rousseau is individual rights make society the best for everyone. Yes, there's different gaps between rich and poor, but there's a reason why homeless people in America have iPhones and homeless people in Africa, in certain countries in Africa do not. Rousseau thinks that that is not good. Individual wills are the problem. Individual wills are what lead to vice and selfishness and vanity. He thinks what you need is the general will. What is the general will? The general will is not where if you got like 100 people together and they all voted what they voted on. That could still be individual wills. The general will, follow me, is what the people should want if they're actually thinking according to Rousseau's system. If they're actually just thinking about what is best for society within Rousseau's worldview, that is actually what the people want, whether they actually want it or not. I don't think you understand how insane and how dangerous what I just said is. Rousseau is, to use a postmodern term, gaslighting people. Forget what you actually say that you want. That's your individual will. We're not going to take a vote like that and just go by the majority. The majority could be selfish. What the people really want, your most true self, your most free self, is the collective. It is what the people should want if they're following Rousseau's system. It is what the people should want if they're just thinking what would be best for society if my own selfish inclinations were not here. Let me say it this way. This comes from a professor I like named Lawrence Cahoon. He gives this example. Is a rich junkie free? Like if somebody who's addicted to, let's say, heroin, and they have all the money where they can just keep getting heroin, is that person really free? Well, they're doing what they want. They have their money. They're buying their heroin. And yet there's something in us that would say, wait a second, that's not the real them. That's not the truest them. They're not actually free. They're not actually doing, listen to this, they're not actually doing what they most want. They're pursuing the drugs, but the real them, the free them, doesn't really want the drugs. Despite their actions, there's this truer self that doesn't want the drugs. That's what Rousseau is saying with politics. Forget what you actually say that you want in politics. Your true self, whether you see it or not, you might be self-deceived, is to go along with the masses in the general will who are thinking according to Rousseau's plan. Let me just say it as bluntly as I can. If you want something different than Rousseau's plan, you are wrong by default. You're being selfish. It's only when you're thinking according to Rousseau's view of human nature and politics that you're actually being your most true, most free self. And if you don't get in line with the program, you will be forced to do so that we can make you free. Holy shit. Let's look at a few quotes and such from Rousseau. In The Social Contract, he says this is a very famous line talking about the general will and such. Whoever refuses to obey the general will be forced to do so by the entire body. This means merely that he will be forced to be free. Also in The Social Contract, the general will is always in the right, but the judgment which guides it is not always enlightened. It must be got to see objects as they are and sometimes as they ought to appear to it. It must be shown the good road it is in search of, secured from the seductive influences of individual wills. Taught to see times and spaces as a series and made to weigh the attractions of present and sensible advantages against the danger of distant and hidden evils. The individuals see the good they reject, the public wills the good it does not see. All stand equally in need of guidance. The former, listen, must be compelled to bring their wills into conformity with their reason. The latter must be taught to know what it wills. You got to teach yourself to actually will the general will instead of what you actually think that you want, yourself deceiving yourself. So this is the death of individual freedom. This is saying anytime you don't agree with Rousseau, you're not actually thinking rightly and you're just being selfish and you don't actually know what's best for you. It's very paternal. He also says in The Social Contract, the constant will of all the members of the state is the general will. Through it, they are citizens and free. When a law is proposed in the People's Assembly, what is asked of them is not, to be precise, whether they approve or reject the proposition, but whether or not it conforms to the general will that is theirs. Each man, in giving his vote, states his opinion on this matter, and the declaration of the general will is drawn from the counting of votes. When, therefore, listen, so he's not against voting, you just could vote the wrong way if you're not voting according to the general will. When, therefore, the opinion contrary to mine prevails, this proves merely that I was in error, and that what I took to be the general will was not so. If my private opinion had prevailed, I would have done something other than what I had wanted. In that case, I would not have been free. Anytime you actually try to pursue your own freedom and liberty, if it doesn't line up with Rousseau and his proto-socialistic system, you're wrong. You don't actually know what's best for you. We will force you to conform because you don't know what's right for you. You just weren't thinking correctly about the general will. Conform or be banished. Remember, Rousseau's trying to do something which doesn't work. Liberty and equality are always opposites. The more liberty you give somebody, it will cause people to be unequal. I don't mean legally unequal. I mean practically, at the end of the day, the things they have. Who has the biggest house or the most money or pursues different jobs, whatever. When you give people full liberty, it will necessarily lead to inequality of outcome. Right? Not formal inequality. You could have legal and equal standing before the law. But when you allow liberty, you're going to have inequality. When you try to force equality, you will stifle liberty. These are opposite ends of the spectrum. The closer you get to one, the further you move away from the other. You don't get to have full liberty and full equality. You're going to have to sacrifice one. You're going to have to say which one is more important. Or you have to say something like, maybe they're not at odds. Maybe by equality, we don't mean equality of outcome, what goods we have at the end of the day, like in a communistic system. Maybe we mean something else. Speaking of communism, proto-communism is all over the place in Rousseau. We for some reason think it started with Marx. There was a lot of thinkers before Marx that had ideas like this. Rousseau is certainly one of them. And then even before Rousseau, Plato had this weird view that we could all live in society, including sharing wives and children. And it was this very utopian, communistic kind of society. It wasn't really tried, but that's in the Republic if you want to read that. Is inequality good or bad? Well, Rousseau obviously thinks that too much inequality is bad. He is communitarian and he is egalitarian, okay? Let me give you several quotes from him on why he thinks. Now notice, by the way, this is a great question just to ask yourself. Is there some moral problem with people just having different things? Right? When we say there's a lot of inequality in America, something like that. We assume just by saying that that's necessarily morally bad. Is that the case? If someone has a bigger house than me, and let's say they got it through a fair means, is that inherently immoral? But let me give you some quotes from Rousseau on these inequalities. This one comes from Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. Speaking of inequalities, he says, such as, here's how he defines them, being richer, more honored, or more powerful. Okay, that's the quote. He believes are, quote, privileges enjoyed by some at the expense of others. Notice, he has a view that, again, is very common in our culture, which is for somebody to have more money, somebody else must have less. Like it's like a pie chart of money. And if someone takes a bigger slice, you don't get any. Instead of realizing that there's no pie chart, like you can just continue putting goods and services into society and make more money. He also says in the social contract, if then there are opponents when the social compact is made, their opposition does not invalidate the contract, but merely prevents them from being included in it. They are foreigners among citizens. Meaning if you don't agree with our system, you're just not really a citizen in the system. We will just kick you out. Okay. So he thinks inequality, even among things like money, that's why I say he's proto-communistic. He thinks any of that type of inequality is bad. He's truly egalitarian. He also believes that you should conform to the state or be killed. Did you hear what I just said? Let me give you some quotes. This comes from the social contract. Again, I'm not making this up. I'm not trying to I'm not trying to use an anachronism and say that Rousseau is a true Marxist communist today. That's not my point. He's not. I'm trying to say that there are elements in his thought which very quickly lead to communism and kind of did to some elements in the French Revolution. So if you take Rousseau logically where he says to go, you end up with North Korea. But typically people just don't take him that far. He says in the social contract, while the state can compel no one to believe, it can banish, not for impiety, but as an antisocial being, incapable of truly loving the laws and justice and of sacrificing, if needed, his life to his duty. If, after having publicly recognized these dogmas, a person acts as if he does not believe them, he should be put to death. That's a quote from Rousseau from the social contract. We give you another one, also from the social contract. The state ought to have a universal compulsory force to move and arrange each part in the manner best suited to the whole. Okay, notice that. So the individual stuff gets cut out. You have to conform to the whole. And if the leaders of the state say to the citizen of the state, quote, it is expedient for the state that you should die, he should die. Also a quote from the social contract. Man. Okay, proto-communism. Let's wrap this up here. Civil religion. What does Rousseau think when it comes to the idea of a civil religion? Rousseau thought that traditional religions did little to change the political climate or help our lives now. It's kind of like Marx calling, religion the opiate of the people. Because traditional religions are mainly about eternity. Yes, you're given ethical commands in this life, but really this life is just something you have to kind of get out of the way and go through so that you can go to heaven or be reincarnated or have a bunch of virgins or whatever it is that your religious view teaches. Rousseau believed that there should be a religion that a nation could get behind that would promote good and social unity. So he has this idea. Again, he changes religions several times. He ended up with a kind of like deism, kind of mixed with Christianity. What he really wants is, he doesn't think that a society can just be atheistic. He thinks that would lead to chaos. Instead, he wants there to be a civil religion that everyone can agree with, that's somewhat generic. Let's not have all these specific doctrines like the Trinity or something like that. Those are going to be divisive. Let's just have a generic belief in kind of this all-powerful being, and let's have belief in an afterlife so it affects our ethics, and let's just kind of have that. But the purpose is to give us something to unite behind. You have to have something that people can agree on in the religious sphere for the good of social cohesion. So for the purpose of social cohesion and social order, he believed that there should be a simple religion without useless divisive or divisive dogmas that affirmed a deity and an afterlife that is held by the citizens. Later on, you would get this cult of reason in France where they just worshiped reason itself. You would get a cult of the supreme being where they're just like, hey, we want to generically worship something, but it's not actually the Judeo-Christian God or something that they would have had before this time in France. But that civil religion idea is pretty prominent and pretty strong in Rousseau. Okay, that's Rousseau. Let's talk about how Rousseau has influenced our culture and maybe even you. Maybe before this lesson, you didn't even know who he was or why he was important. Let me just mention 10 quick things where you might have been influenced by Rousseau, or at least you see that our culture has been. Number one, if you believe community rights should trump individual rights, let's silence some people, let's shut down their opinions, let's cancel them because their views are harmful to society. They offend people, they could be wrong, and so let's shut that down so that we can just have social cohesion and just have everybody believe the major narrative. That's Rousseau. If you elevate tone or kindness as more important or as equally important as truth, if you think humans and the world are naturally good, an institution and culture is what have corrupted us. So if you think, again, that you're born good or neutral, and then basically society and nurture, not nature, but nurture is what makes you bad, that's Rousseau. If you want more egalitarianism among people, practical equality at the end of the day when it comes to the things they have and the power and the status and the money they have, that is Rousseau. If your ethic is based on sentimentality instead of logic, if your ethical system is based on how you feel, or someone's sad, or you don't want them to feel bad, that's Rousseau. If you think that you should not physically discipline children, that's Rousseau. If you think people should be canceled or silenced for the good of the masses if they exercise their free speech in a way that you find offensive, that is Rousseau. If you hold anything related to socialism or communism, that is Rousseau. If you think competition and progress make us worse, make us less moral, there's a sense that this is the opposite, for example, of what the Puritans thought. The Puritans thought that by working harder, you were actually being more faithful. So it's a different view than other belief systems when it comes to progress and competition and working hard. And then lastly, if you think true freedom / living is thinking what society or the state tells you you should think, that is Rousseau. What do you think of Rousseau? Well, let me end by giving you Voltaire's mocking response to Rousseau. I love Voltaire, by the way. Again, I'm a big Enlightenment guy. I'm an early modern philosophy guy. That's actually my specialty in philosophy is early modern philosophy. So Bacon and Descartes through Kant, even though Rousseau and Kant are kind of anti-Enlightenment figures. Voltaire, who I love, writes a mocking response after reading Rousseau's work. And Voltaire, who's so witty, says the following thing to Rousseau. Listen to this. This is a great way to end. He says, I have received your new book, Against the Human Race, and thank you for it. You see the sarcasm here, calling against the human race and thanking him for it. Voltaire continues, never was such a cleverness used in the design of making us all stupid. One longs, in reading your book, to walk on all fours, meaning to go back so far to a state of nature that we're walking on all fours. Voltaire continues, but as I have lost that habit for more than 60 years, I feel unhappily the impossibility of resuming it. Nor can I embark in the search of the savages of Canada, because war is going on in those regions and because the example of our actions has made the savages nearly as bad as ourselves. What a great response. He's like, hey, Rousseau, thanks for your book that tries to make fun of all humanity, even though we're now more progressed and better than we've ever been. I read your book and it makes me want to go back to a state of nature, walking on all fours, but man, I've been so busy walking on two legs for 60 years, I don't know that I can go back. And I also, you mentioned the state of nature thing and how people, before there's all this European society corrupting us, what about the savages in other parts of the world that are killing each other? Take a Red Bull break for that, just so that you can let that soak in. Rousseau's whole idea is that we're born naturally good or neutral. And so in society where we're not corrupted by institution, I mean, in like a tribal society where we're just small, living in the woods, just among ourselves, everything would be fine. And it's society and institutions that corrupt us. And Voltaire says, wait a second, idiot. There are a lot of tribes in the world that have not been corrupted by European institutions. And you know what they do? They cannibalize people. They fight in wars. they commit adultery, they do all the bad things anyway. So maybe your entire thesis is just plain stupid. Oh, Voltaire for the win. Anyway, that is Rousseau. I hope you've enjoyed learning about this horrendous figure. Highly encourage you to read him if you haven't read him. He is a lot of fun to read. He is a fun author, even though his arguments are not necessarily consistent with one another. But that is Rousseau. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks for hopping on this lesson and learning about Jean-Jacques Rousseau.